The pine orchard house on South Mountain was considered one of the noblest wonders in the East. All foreign visitors were taken to see it as a matter of course. Harriet Martineau had written of it that she would rather have missed the prairies, the Mississippi, or even Niagara than this. The mountain house's fame rested not on its excellent cuisine, nor its elegant Greek Revival facade with the 13 white Corinthian columns, nor yet on the Beach family's efficient management. It exalted the romantic 19th century heart by its location on the edge of a 2,500-foot precipice, and in consequence its spectacular, awe-inspiring view. When Miranda walked through the hotel and stepped out on the piazza, she gasped, as everyone gasped. The Hudson Valley lay spread out beneath her, its fertile fields stained mauve in the sun's afterglow. 8 miles to the east, the great river, diminished to a brooklet, curled like a silver shaving from Albany to Rhinebeck. 50 miles away in Massachusetts, the Berkshires thrust dark, irregular humps against the horizon. From time to time, a trailing cloud of mist floated by, obscuring the farms so far below and accentuating the feeling of dizzy height. Flying must be like this, sighed Miranda. Always intensely affected by her surroundings, it seemed to her that living in the presence of that view, one could be eternally joyous. One would get nearer to God, who had lately receded to a nebulous vagueness where her hurried and self-conscious prayers did not reach. Nicholas's amused contempt for religion had had its effect. She no longer read her Bible at all, and she had skipped church on the last 3 Sundays. Not that Nicholas prevented her from going exactly, but there did seem to arise many difficulties. Even though St. Mark's was around the corner from the townhouse, he insisted that she be accompanied by one of the servants and take the carriage. Nor would he go with her himself. Moreover, she was gradually sleeping later and later in the mornings, for there were social events in the evenings, and even when there were not, Nicholas was seldom ready to retire before midnight. For some days she rejoiced in everything. Their 3-room suite, the coolness of the mountain air, the well-dressed, pleasant-looking people whom she saw in the dining room at meals, or in the ballroom during the evening concerts, or on the piazza, rocking and enjoying the wonderful view. She longed to meet some of these people, the young couple from Charleston, the noisy Benton family, Mamma, Papa, and 4 assorted children, who had traveled here from Boston and never tired of amusing the dining room with humorous accounts of that journey, or even the trio of placid old ladies who preempted one corner of the piazza in which to knit and rock and sip lemonade while they gossiped. But Nicholas, it seemed, had no intention of fraternizing with anyone. He snubbed 1 or 2 tentative overtures, and after that they were left to themselves. This remoteness produced no hostility. Everyone knew they were on their honeymoon, but it did increase the other guests' interest in the romantic couple. 2 weeks passed quickly, for though there was no relaxation near Nicholas, neither could there be boredom. It was, in fact, for dullness that she unconsciously longed, a slackening of the tension. Nicholas's comparative indifference to the marriage relation, an indifference which had lasted for weeks, and which she in her innocence assumed to be normal, gave place again to violent passion. These opposing cycles were to continue throughout her marriage, and it was not surprising that she never learned to anticipate them, nor dared receive either mood with anything but submission. Marriage, she thought, must always be like this, and if it weren't, there was no way of finding out. One would die rather than speak to anyone about such subjects. Often there was the dark, shamed pleasure, but always there was pain, and she felt that her body was to him only an instrument, without personal identity. But one must submit, out of fear, for the slightest resistance increased his brutality. Out of duty, a wife should always obey her husband. Under these lay like a layer of granite beneath quicksand the fundamental reason, the willing enslavement of her senses and soul. On the 1st of July, Nicholas told her that he was going to leave her next morning for 3 days, and she felt a wave of quickly suppressed relief. "I've given orders for you to have all your meals served in the sitting-room while I'm away," said Nicholas. "Naturally, I don't want you to appear alone in the dining-room." She knew it was useless to protest, but she was disappointed. She had vaguely hoped to make friends with the Benton family, or even one of the nice old ladies who sat on the piazza. "If only I had someone to talk to," she thought, and then reproached herself. A bride did not yearn for outsiders. "Come, my dear," said Nicholas, ringing for the hotel valet. "Let's get dressed for our walk." This was the usual morning procedure. They had explored all the mountain paths for miles around. Nicholas had sent his servants to Dragonwyck to help in preparing the house, knowing that the excellent hotel service would be sufficient for their needs. Miranda indeed had little use for a personal maid. She enjoyed caring for her lovely clothes herself. But there was a great deal of laundry and pressing to be done as well, petticoats to be starched, body linen daily renewed, morning caps freshened with the pinking iron, and this she could not do herself. This work was attended to by one of the 2 chambermaids, who were assigned to their suite. Silent automatons in calico aprons and mob caps, who had no individuality for her, except that she had noted that one of them was very young and walked with a slight limp. This was the maid who presented herself this morning in response to an angry ring. For Miranda, on examining the freshly laundered pile of linen from the night before, had discovered that a ruffle on her best India muslin negligee had been scorched to shreds, then clumsily sewn together in a transparent effort to hide the damage. "Do you know how this happened?" asked Miranda sharply, pointing to the gown. There was no answer. The maid twisted her hands in her apron. "Well," Miranda persisted more quietly, "did you do it?" The girl was painfully thin and nondescript. The pink uniform hung slack on her undernourished body. The perky mob cap was askew on lustreless brown hair. The square face with its prominent Celtic cheekbones made a dim setting for the staring, frightened eyes. Miranda waited, and at last the girl moistened her lips. "The iron was too hot, mum. Please don't tell, mum. They'll turn me away without a character." She swallowed, her jerking hands twisting the apron into a ball. "Oh, lady dear," she added in a choking voice, "I'm terrible ashamed to be a spoilin' of your pretty things, but I never a flat iron in me hand till I come here." Miranda put the scorched gown on the bed. "Should you be doing the pressing if you don't know how?" "No, mum." The girl hung her head. She looked up at Miranda through black lashes. A faint impression of the irrepressible Irish twinkle appeared. "But they don't know that, mum. Sure, I had to be telling a bit of a fib to get this job. The blessed saints forgive me." To her own surprise, Miranda felt attracted by the girl. She was appealing and might be pretty if she didn't look so much like a starved little kitten. "Is the job so important to you, then? What is your name, by the way?" she asked. "Peggy O'Malley, mum, and I'm fresh off the boat last month. Sure, and I'm as green as the shamrocks that grow in the fields at home. But as to the job, mum," she sobered again. The light went out of her eyes. "It's all I have in the world, my job, and not so easy to get for me." Miranda suddenly remembered the limp. No, it wouldn't be easy for a raw Irish immigrant to find another situation, especially when there were such hordes of husky, able-bodied ones to choose from. "I'll mend the ruffle, Peggy, and you'll be more careful, won't you?" The girl seized Miranda's hand and kissed it. "The saints bless your kind heart, mum. I'll try every iron on me own skin before I touch it to anything of yours." She bobbed a curtsy and hurried away down the hall. On the following morning at 7, Nicholas left the hotel by stage for Catskill Landing and the boat to Dragonwyck. After he had gone, she moved restlessly around their rooms, unable to settle down to the few activities which Nicholas had permitted her. She might go out for a walk at 11, but otherwise he expected her to remain in their suite. Young Mrs. Van Ryn must not wander unescorted around the public rooms of the hotel. Well, there were letters to write home, plenty of books to read, and a copy of Godey's in which to study the latest fashions. There was her embroidery tambour in which she was creating a masterpiece of garden flowers in coloured silk. And there was the view to admire. Enough diversions, surely, for 3 days. But as the morning passed, she found that none of them appealed to her. Gradually she realized that part of her restlessness came from physical discomfort. There were fleeting twinges of nausea, a heaviness in her stomach. Could it be the fish last night, she wondered? She went to the marble-top wash-basin behind the screen in her room and searched among the bottles of lotion and toilet water. There were so many that she had forgotten what they all contained, but she had no real hope of finding any medicine. Both she and Nicholas enjoyed superb health. I must send out for some Hutchings stomach bitters, she thought, remembering Abigail's pet remedy for digestive disturbance. The effort of ringing and giving the order seemed, however, tremendous, and she lay down instead. After a 2 hours' sleep, she awoke feeling much better and extremely hungry. She ordered for herself an immense dinner. Roast beef, cold tongue, chicken in aspic, cream kisses, and syllabub. When this meal arrived and the waiter had set the round table in the parlour, she found that after a few mouthfuls all her appetite had vanished. The sight of the laden dishes and hot plate revolted her. She pushed back her chair and rang for the waiter, who had gone elsewhere on business of his own, thinking that he had a clear hour at least before Mrs. Van Ryn could possibly do justice to that meal. So it was Peggy who answered the bell. "Yes, mum," she said, curtsying. "You'd be wanting something?" Miranda nodded, gesturing feebly toward the food. "Get rid of this stuff, please, at once." She leaned her swimming head against the antimacassar and shut her eyes. Peggy gave her a puzzled look and obediently limped to the table. She looked at the thick slices of rare beef in the congealing gravy, the mountain of fluffy mashed potatoes down which ran rivulets of butter, the half ox tongue, the jellied chicken garnished with truffles, and she made a queer little sound. "Peggy," cried Miranda, starting up, "what is the matter?" The other girl bit her lips, began piling the dishes under the Britannia metal covers. "It's just me foolishness, Mum. It came over me all at once, how just one wee part of all this would have—" "Would have what?" persisted Miranda, putting her hand softly on the maid's shoulder. Peggy raised her head. "Mither and the baby died of starvation on St. Patrick's Day," she said dully. "There's famine in Ireland, Mum." Miranda stared at the girl, appalled. There had been occasional newspaper mention of food shortage in Ireland, but it hadn't impressed Miranda, nor as yet the rest of America, which would not begin to ship cargoes of cornmeal to the starving people for another year, when the potato blight had reached devastating magnitude. "I wish I could help you," said Miranda slowly. Money, she thought, a huge tip, but she had no money, no more than $1 in her purse. Nicholas would fee the hotel servants in exact proportion to their efficiency, and he had already remarked that Peggy was careless and not well trained. Peggy smiled the warm smile that illuminated her plain little face. "I'm needing no help, bless you. I've got me 2 hands, and soon I'll have enough to pay back to Father Donovan the passage money he lent me," she said sturdily. "Sit you down, Mum. You look a bit white. Here I'm blabbering instead of doing what you told me." She whisked around the table, vanished for a moment, and came back with a tray, uttered an exclamation of concern as she saw Miranda, who had suffered a violent attack of nausea and tottered to a chair where she slumped panting. The maid flung the tray down and rushed to help. Even through the spasms of retching and vomiting, Miranda was conscious of the gentleness of the hands that held her head, and of the soothing little murmurs. "Poor pretty darling, you'll do fine now. Put your head on my shoulder. There's a wet rag for your poor face. Now, to bed with you, quick." Miranda found herself on the bed, the comforter tucked tight around her exhausted body, and Peggy anxiously leaning over her and stroking her hair. "Thank you," whispered Miranda, trying to smile. "I'm so sorry. I guess the fish last night was tainted." The little maid's eyes twinkled. "I wouldn't be thinking it was the fish, Mum." "It couldn't be the cholera starting," cried Miranda, alarmed. Peggy laughed outright. "Nor the cholera neither, I'll be bound." She leaned over and whispered a question. "Why, yes," answered Miranda, mentally counting days and still puzzled. "But what could that—" She checked herself in astonishment. She had no biological knowledge whatever except that derived from observation of the farm animals, but suddenly she had a dim memory of Abigail's sufferings in the months before Charity was born. "Well then, Mum," said Peggy, both amused and touched. "I can't believe it," murmured Miranda, half to herself. There was no gladness, no realization of the inevitable changes, no thought even of Nicholas. Nothing but this blank unbelief. "It's nature, Mum," said Peggy briskly. "First the bed and then the cradle, as me poor mother used to say. I'll be leaving you to rest now." "No, don't go, please." Miranda held out her hand. "I don't want to be alone. I'll make it all right with a housekeeper if you're worrying about the work. Only stay and talk to me a while." The maid looked at the pale face on the pillow. The forlorn note in Miranda's voice sped to her heart. As far as Peggy could see, the poor lady had naught in the world to trouble her beyond she was a bit queasy in the stomach. And yet she was troubled. A blindfolded bat could see that. And to be sure, the rich weren't always happy, hard as it was to believe. "What'll I talk to you of, Mum?" she asked gently. "Tell me about your home in Ireland, unless it hurts you to speak of it." Miranda cared little what the other girls said. She wanted companionship while she tried to adjust herself to this startling possibility that she was not ready to face. So Peggy talked, her brogue thickening as she forgot herself and the lady on the bed in memories of home. She came from one of the loveliest spots in Ireland, the banks of Loch Lean in Killarney. Beneath the thatched roof of the sod shanty there had always been poverty, but there had been merriment too. No matter how thin the milk in the wooden bowls, or how few the potatoes, there would be a crackle of wit from the handsome red-headed mother to make them forget the emptiness of their bellies. And then the little Kerry cow died, and there was no milk at all. Soon there were no potatoes either. One day the red-headed mother quietly lay down on the straw pallet with her month-old baby in her arms. Nor did she get up again. They would all have starved, for the neighbours were in like case, without the help of the parish priest and the squire. These two men, distracted by the increasing misery in their town, did what they could. They sent Peggy's father to Belfast, where there was still work and food. They boarded the 3 surviving O'Malley children in the charity school, and they contrived to ship Peggy and the other grown youngsters from their district to America, the land of plenty. But it was not on the past dreadful spring that Peggy dwelt, nor on the 21 days she had spent jammed into a stinking hole with other immigrants. She told of the beauties of Killarney and its 3 lakes shimmering like magic jewels in the soft haze beneath the mountains. She told of the roses that grew of their own accord and scarcely needed tending in that warm, moist climate, and of the arbutus wood which she and her brothers had delighted to whittle into fragrant boxes. Miranda laughed. "Peggy, you do me good." She had ceased thinking of her as an ignorant and handicapped little chambermaid. Somehow, during the past hour, she had come to think of her as a friend. The sympathy between them cut through the difference in their upbringing and their stations. And yet their stations were not originally so very far apart, thought Miranda, with a shock of surprise. She, too, had been reared on a potato farm. "How much do you make a month here, Peggy?" she asked suddenly. The girl looked anxious. Trouble often swooped down from unexpected quarters, and the job was so precious. $4 a month, Mum, not counting me tips when I get 'em." Miranda sat up in bed. "Will you leave here and come to me as my maid? I'll give you—" She hesitated, knowing well that there would be difficulty with Nicholas. She went on quickly. $20 a month. That'll help with the younger children, and to pay back Father Donovan, won't it?" Peggy drew away from the bed, staring at the lady, whose face between the long braids of wheat-colored hair was as pleading as though she begged a favor. "Holy Mother of God, you not be making a game of me, Mum." "Of course not. I want you, Peggy." And as she said these words, they crystallized her desire. She wanted Peggy desperately, as an ally, someone that belonged to her in a world dominated by Nicholas, particularly at Dragonwyck. Nor until this second had Miranda realized how much she dreaded the return to Dragonwyck. Peggy kneeled down beside the bed and put her rough hand timidly on Miranda's slim fingers. "'Twould be the grace of heaven for me, lady dear. But have you not forgot," she swallowed, "me leg that was broke when I fell from the haymow 10 years gone and grew back crooked? Not but that I'm strong and well able to work despite it." She finished fiercely to forestall the pity she dreaded. "That doesn't matter in the least," said Miranda. She squeezed the hand which lay on hers. "Then it's all settled?" So, by the time Nicholas was expected on the evening stage 2 days later, Peggy was established as Miranda's personal maid. Miranda had amused herself by dressing the girl in a new uniform. She had cut down and shortened one of her own dimity morning dresses, had made a coquettish cap and apron, and taught Peggy to pin her brown hair into 2 tidy coils over her ears. The transformation delighted both girls. Peggy now looked trim and smart. She held herself proudly. In return, she nursed Miranda through 2 bouts of morning sickness, and attacked the freshening of her mistress's wardrobe with an anxious eagerness that made up for her lack of skill. At first, she hung the steel hoops inside out, laced the tiny whalebone corsets backward, sewed a gold bodice button onto a glove, and put the best white pot de soie bonnet into the bandbox meant for overshoes. But she learned fast, and her dismay at these mischances was leavened with so much humor that Miranda was amused and never irritated. Miranda set the stage for Nicholas's return with a subtlety she hadn't known she possessed. She ordered a delicate supper of the things he liked best: hot liver pâté, a fillet of bass in aspic, chilled sauterne. With Peggy's help, she washed her hair and brushed it the requisite 100 strokes. "He likes it flowing," she said thoughtfully. "I believe he likes my hair better than anything about me." "Small wonder, Mum," replied Peggy, looking at the golden mantle that rippled down to Miranda's slender hips. "Can you not leave it loose, then?" Both of them had entered into a tacit conspiracy. Both knew, without ever having mentioned it, that the continuance of this new relationship that meant so much to both lonely girls depended on propitiation, on the use of every possible weapon. Miranda shook her head. "It's not seemly." She compromised by stuffing all the shining mass loosely into a pink chenille net. The net matched her foaming mousseline gown, also the color of a pink seashell. "And now your jewels, Mum. Slathers of 'em," cried Peggy, clapping her hands and gazing at the vision before her. Miranda smiled and shook her head. "This gown looks better without jewelry, except perhaps a cameo brooch. Wait a minute, though." She paused in the act of pinning on the cameo. There was a jewel which would set the dress off to perfection. She hesitated, frowning. But after all, why not? She sent Peggy to the hotel safe for the huge leather case, unlocked it, and lifted out 2 trays. On the bottom, in a velvet box, lay the ruby pendant. She lifted it out, and, cupping it in her palm, stared at it with a fascinated repulsion. Against how many other breasts, now stilled forever, had it already lain, this cold and indifferent jewel? It seemed to her that the ruby shimmered with a baleful mockery. "Whatever's wrong, Mum?" whispered Peggy. "The last woman to wear this jewel is dead," she said, half aloud. "The saints preserve us!" cried Peggy, crossing herself. "Don't wear it, Mum. Put it back." Miranda did not move. She continued to stare at the pendant. Then her gaze travelled slowly to the open case. All these jewels belong to the dead. That's how they came to me. "Well, to be sure," said Peggy reasonably, "most of the gentry's gear does pass on to others after death. 'Tis but your condition a-giving you dark fancies. Wisht, Mum, you should be thinking of the new life that's in you, not worrying over what's past." The shadow gradually lifted from Miranda's face. "Yes," she said, "I guess you're right." She picked up the pendant, slipped the fine gold chain around her neck, and bent her head so that the maid could fasten the clasp. "'Tis fair as a queen you are, Mum," cried Peggy, admiring the result. Miranda smiled faintly and looked at the china mantel clock. "Go now, please. It's almost time." The maid nodded and hurried out to her cubicle in the attic. She reached under her straw pillow for the rosary, made of arbutus wood it was, Killarney arbutus. She kissed the little crucifix and began to pray for the outcome of the interview downstairs. Miranda saw in one quick, thankful glance that Nicholas had returned in excellent humour. The rent day had passed quietly with no unpleasantness. Each tenant had brought his proper tribute. The bailiff asserted that the manor was running well. The house, too, was ready. As he greeted Miranda and complimented her on the gown, his eyes rested a moment on the pendant. She had the impression that he stiffened. She thought in that moment that he stared at the ruby that he was going to tell her to take it off, but she was wrong. He laughed instead. "I see that the pendant has at last found a setting worthy of it." And he bent his head and kissed her breast just above the jewel. After the little supper, and he complimented her on that too, he drew her to the open window. It was a night of stars, and a frail new moon hung high amongst them over the dark valley. At her first laughing words, "Nicholas, I've something to confess. You see, while you were gone—" His arm dropped from her waist. He shut the window and drew the curtains. "Well, my pretty one, what is it?" he asked lightly enough, but his eyes had hardened to that agate-like blue. The reassuring beauty of the night was shut out, and there was no support in the conventional hotel room or the flaring oil lamps. She forgot her carefully thought-out speech, stammered, and floundered. "You mean," said Nicholas incredulously, "that you engaged that untidy little cripple to be your personal maid?" Miranda clenched her hands. "She's not untidy any more, and she's not a cripple. She's had a miserable life. She's—" "My dear girl, that's a singular recommendation. If you want to hire all the sluts who've led miserable lives, we'll have to build a city at Dragonwyck." Nicholas sat down on the plush-covered sofa and crossed his legs. "You twist everything," she cried desperately. "Please, please try to understand. I want Peggy. She's bright and willing. You said I could have my own maid." "I've already engaged one, a well-trained Frenchwoman. She will join you at Dragonwyck." "But I don't want her. I want Peggy." The childish hopelessness of her wail echoed in her ears. Despair seized her. He loathed tears. They never moved him to anything but amusement. She controlled herself with agonizing effort. "Please, Nicholas, if you love me. It's so little to ask." She moved over to him, her hands outstretched, instinctively in her desperation trying to use woman's ultimate weapon, the frank lure of her body. He laughed, though he continued to regard her with chill implacability. "Oh, yes, you're quite lovely, my dear, but all the same you'll dismiss your new acquisition in the morning." She drew a harsh breath, looking at him with a helpless fury. There was one last resort. She had not meant to use it, nor had she any hope that it would work. She threw her head back and spoke with a roughness foreign to her nature. "I've been sick these last days, vomiting. I think I'm going to have a baby." The change in his face petrified her. He jumped up, grabbing her arms at the elbows, almost shaking her. "Do you mean it, Miranda? Are you sure?" She nodded. "Are you glad?" she asked angrily. "Does that at least please you?" She saw the exultation in his eyes. She did not need his answer. "Can I have Peggy, then?" she pursued inexorably. He took her hand and raised it to his lips. "You may have anything in heaven or hell, Miranda, if you'll give me a son." Many times during the next months, Miranda was to ponder over the extravagance of that statement, the tone of his voice as he made it. At the time, she had been too much exhausted by her struggle for Peggy, too much relieved by her unexpected victory to attach any great importance to it. She had always known that Nicholas, like most men, particularly those with large property to pass on, had wanted an heir. It was natural enough. But his attitude, now that there was prospect of one, was not. From that night at the mountain house, his manner toward her changed entirely. Without exception, his every word and action were directed toward safeguarding her health and tranquility. Whereas before he had taken pleasure in thwarting most of her wishes and bending her will to his, he now humored her in every way. He cherished her, as one cherishes perforce the instrument which will fulfill one's desire. Chapter 16. For the next weeks, Miranda's physical sufferings were too insistent to allow room for any other emotion. She had dreaded the return to Dragonwyck, but when the riverboat express churned up to the landing, and she saw the familiar towered silhouette against the eastern sky, the manor represented nothing but a place in which to lie down in a darkened room and fight off the ever-recurring nausea. Nicholas picked her up and carried her into Dragonwyck. "No, please," she cried faintly. "I can walk. It's too humiliating." For she saw rows of servants ranged on either side of the great hall waiting to receive them. "It's entirely proper for a husband to carry his bride into her new home," said Nicholas lightly. "Don't fret, my darling." The nausea ebbed. There would be a weak but blessed peace for a while. Miranda opened her eyes and gazed past Nicholas' solicitous face. She saw 3 great windows in front of her and 2 northern ones on her right. "This is Johanna's room," she thought, and a chill that was not physical crept through her. "But I mustn't be foolish," she thought, and raising her head a little, she forced herself to examine the room and saw with grateful relief that everything had been changed. Green satin replaced the red plush curtains. A fawn-colored aubusson covered the floor. Gone was the untidy clutter of furniture with which Johanna had surrounded herself. There were now but 3 fine mahogany pieces and a couple of small chairs. The spacious room was revealed in its true proportions. All was changed, with one exception. Her tired eyes roamed upward and she stiffened. She had not at first realized, because the old brocaded tester had been replaced with green satin to match the draperies, but there was no mistaking the coat of arms on the headboard or the 4 massive columns. Miranda turned her head violently and shut her eyes. "Feeling badly again?" asked Nicholas. "No, it's not that. Nicholas, I don't want to sleep in this bed." He answered her with unexpected patience, even explaining his reasons. This was the Van Ryn ancestral bed. For generations all those of his blood had been born and died on it. It was here that the lord and lady of the manor always slept. It was here that his child would be born. Any other request he would be glad to grant, but on this point he was adamant. "Let it be, then," thought Miranda wearily. "What does it matter, after all?" Soon the great bed would become as familiar as it was undeniably comfortable. She would no longer see that gruesome night when the tapers had stood on either side, and it had supported that motionless figure with the little subtle smile on its pale face. She must never look back again, never. She was now the mistress of Dragonwyck and of Van Ryn. The past was gone. She must have no trailing tendrils of guilt or fear, or even of pity. She must cooperate with Nicholas in his tacit elimination of all that might remind them of that previous year she had spent at Dragonwyck. There was, however, one legacy from the past which she could not conscientiously deny. There was Katrina. Surely it was time that the child came back to her father. 2 days later she broached this to Nicholas. "If you would like Katrina here for a visit, I've no objection," he said, "but I see no reason for it. She's well cared for by her aunt, to whom I make a handsome allowance. She has besides many little cousins to play with, I believe." This was reasonable enough, but she felt beneath his temperate words his aversion to the idea and the indifference he had always shown to Katrina. "She's your daughter, Nicholas. Don't you ever miss her or want to see her?" cried Miranda with sudden vehemence. He was silent for several minutes. "I doubt that she would want to come here, my dear. She has been under other influences." At first she did not understand him. "You mean that Katrina wouldn't want to see me?" He shrugged, thinking of the outraged letters he had received from Johanna's relatives after the news of his remarriage had reached Albany. "I think the child may be prejudiced, and she does very well where she is. I shall run up to see her some day." Miranda was silenced. It had been stupid of her not to realize that Katrina would suffer at being brought back to this scene of her mother's death, or that she might have been taught to resent Miranda as the supplanter. It was not only the Van Tappens who disapproved of Nicholas's marriage. All the upriver families were horrified. The topic enlivened many a tea party in the drawing-rooms of Claverack and Kinderhook and Greenbush. "The scheming little upstart," they said. "No birth or breeding, nothing but youth and a pretty face. Why must men be such fools?" Some, like Mrs. Henry Van Rensselaer, balked of an alliance for one of her daughters, were more bitter. There was something going on between those two, even in poor Johanna's lifetime. "I saw it with my own eyes," they whispered. "The whole matter is disgraceful, shocking. Nothing would induce me to call on them." Nor did they call. Nicholas was profoundly annoyed, but he hid it from Miranda, as he protected her from every unpleasantness at this time. He surrounded her with an anxious solicitude, constantly ordering dishes which might tempt her precarious stomach, sending her to bed at 9, taking her for short walks or drives from which they always returned before there was a possibility of her tiring. All this contented and reassured her. Except that their scale of living was more magnificent than that of most couples, the Van Ryns represented the epitome of the domestic felicity of the time. Life was suspended, hushed into a pleasing monotony. There were no violences, no clashes. The past and the future both melted into distance. The outside world had become unreal. She knew vaguely that the progress of the war with Mexico was gratifying. In September there had been a victory at Monterey, and she had wondered about Jeff. Still, the thought of victory somehow seemed to include safety, and Jeff was as shadowy as everything else. Even her disappointment that her mother could not after all come to her soon vanished. Nicholas had reversed his decision about Abigail. If Miranda wanted her mother, she might by all means invite her. The letter had been sent at once. The carefully unalarming reply gave no hint of the misery that had gone into the writing of it. For years Abigail had suffered from periodic attacks of rheumatism, which she bore with a grim and silent endurance. This time the attack did not pass. It swelled her fingers, her knees, and in her right hip there was a constant grinding pain. She could barely creep around the house. She could not have endured the trip to Dragonwyck. Her letter minimized the pain and indicated another reason. Tabitha's time is coming soon, and I must bide with her. She hasn't a household of servants to care for her like you, wrote Abigail. Later, very likely I can come. Take care of yourself, my dear child, but don't coddle over much. Be thankful you have such a good husband. For Miranda's letters were full of Nicholas's care and tenderness. In November, even Nicholas's desire to protect her from any emotion which might possibly interfere with his child's development was not proof against a shattering calamity. When the news reached them, they sat after supper in the Red Room. No malignant or superstitious influences about that room now. Miranda sometimes wondered how she had ever been silly enough to imagine that there were. The door burst open, and Dirk Dijkman, Nicholas' bailiff, clattered in. His moon face glistened. His disordered homespun suit was flecked with horse sweat. "It's bad, sir, very bad," he cried, trying to get his breath. Miranda stared blankly from one to the other. She saw a quiver pass over Nicholas, then he lifted his head. "Out with it. Don't stand there blabbering." The bailiff passed a grimy handkerchief over his face. "Young is in, sir. He's to pardon 'em all, the skunks, even Botten. The state constitution's to be changed. It's the end, sir, the end of the manor." Miranda gasped. Her frightened eyes flew to Nicholas, who stood as though carved from the granite on which Dragonwyck rested. Last week he had driven over to Hudson on election day to vote, but he had told her nothing of the election's importance to them. He had expressed no doubts that Governor Wright might fail of re-election, or that John Young, passionate anti-renter, might sweep the state. "What does it mean, Nicholas?" she whispered. "I don't understand." As he did not answer, but continued to stand rigid, his narrowed eyes looking through both of them without seeing them, she turned to the bailiff, who shuffled uneasily, casting a nervous glance at Nicholas, whom he had always feared. "It means, ma'am, that the manor can't hold together no more. The farms must go to whoever wants to buy 'em. The down renters have won at last." "Never," said Nicholas quietly. This calm assertion frightened the bailiff far more than if Mr. Van Ryn had shouted and cursed as any other man would. He moistened his lips. "You can't help it, sir. 'Twill be law. The Van Rensselaers have given in already. They say as how the Patroon even said it was a good thing." "Perhaps it is then, Nicholas," put in Miranda timidly, hoping to wipe from his face that frozen look. "If you refuse to sell, won't it mean a great deal more trouble? And after all, would it make so much difference? We'd still have all these acres around the house." He wheeled on her, glaring at her with fury. "You little fool! Do you think because a prating idiot in Albany says so that I'll give up—" His eyes fell to the white lace shawl which concealed the slight distortion of her figure. "I beg your pardon, my dear," he said in his normal voice. "I'm being exceedingly thoughtless. Dirk," he turned to the goggling bailiff, "you may go." The man went out, muttering. If the Patroon wanted to battle law and the entire country, that was his business. He was pig-headed enough to try. "But I'll have no part of it," thought Dirk. "I've got my belly full of threats and bloodshed and shots in the dark. Out west I'll go, Be my own master for a change." Miranda readily forgave Nicholas his anger. She knew that the manor system meant more to him than it did to others, and that to him any curtailment of power was unthinkable, literally unthinkable, in that he would refuse to recognize the possibility. She partially understood that the manor was to him a symbol. It was his kingdom and his birthright. Had he been the king of Naples or Prussia, his attitude would have been no different. But this was not Europe, and America was not a kingdom but a republic. Willingly or not, they were subject to the laws of the democracy in which they lived. The manor was a hangover from the past, not even the past of this country, but an abortive offshoot from medieval Europe. The expanding republic had lopped it off like any other dead branch. Miranda did not realize how much of her ready acceptance of the situation she owed to Jeff. When he had been at the farm, he had sometimes talked of the evils of the manor system, and she had closed her mind in a stubborn resistance mixed with contempt. But she had heard none the less. After all, she thought with feminine practicality, the breaking up of the manor would affect neither their wealth nor their home, and it would certainly turn a hostile tenantry into peaceful neighbors. If only Nicholas would accept defeat for once. She looked at him wistfully, and knew how futile this hope was. He would never accept a thwarting of his will in any matter, great or small. If he seemed to do so, it was only that a stronger and more hidden purpose might be served. "I don't see what you can do, Nicholas," she said quietly, "if it's the law now that you must give up the farms." "I shall never give them up," he returned with equal quiet. "The manor will go intact to my son." He walked over to her, and resting his hand on her shoulder said, "Miranda, can you doubt that I am always master of circumstance? Would you be here with me, bearing my child, if I were not?" She looked up at him startled. His words were true enough, and yet it seemed that his voice carried a dark and secret emphasis. It was as though she heard a warning bell from shoals muffled by fog, a faint and sinister tolling from far away. Her eyes widened. "Why do you look like that, Nicholas?" she whispered. He took his hand from her shoulder and smiled quite naturally. "You must worry about nothing, my love, nothing. The manor affairs are my concern. You needn't give them another thought. You must go to bed now. It's getting late." He bent and kissed her forehead. She obeyed him silently, walked past him and up the great curving stairs. In her room, Peggy awaited her as usual. The peaked little face had filled out in these months, had acquired a pixie-like prettiness. She was happy at Dragonwyck, happy in her service to the lady of the manor. The other servants liked Peggy, for her ready Irish tongue was quick but never wounding, and her infirmity touched them. So they forgave her the little important airs that sprang from her position as the mistress's personal maid, and they forgave her her jealous refusal to let anyone but herself tend Miranda. "'Tis late you are tonight, Mum," the maid said anxiously when she saw her mistress walk in, her blonde head drooping. "You'll not be too tired." Miranda smiled vague greeting and did not answer. The misty fear which had seized her when Nicholas touched her shoulder had receded, but it had left a clinging wisp of disquiet behind. She dropped wearily into one of the needlepoint chairs, closing her eyes, while Peggy brushed the loosened hair in long, soothing strokes. After a while, physical comforts brought direct physical peace. The cedarwood fire crackled cheerily and gave out a faint fragrance. The room was in exquisite order, as Peggy had been taught to keep it. The great bed's sheet had been turned down, and a hot brick wrapped in flannel subdued the iciness of its lavender-scented linen. Peggy had forgotten nothing: the hot milk which Miranda must drink, the exact placing of the pillows so that they might best support a body that had grown clumsy and hard to rest. "Better now?" asked Peggy tenderly as she tucked in the blankets and arranged the coverlet. Miranda started to nod, then gave an exclamation of surprise. Her hands flew to her abdomen. "Peggy!" she cried. "What was that?" The little maid paled. "It wasn't a pain." Miranda shook her head. "No pain. A queer fluttering, like a bird inside there." Peggy clasped her hands. "Oh, the saints be thanked! I've been so worried, Mum. 'Tis life you're feeling, lady dear, your little baby moving within you." Miranda pushed down the covers and gazed at herself in amazement. "It had never seemed real before," she said, half laughing, half bewildered. During all these months of illness and lethargy, the baby had been an intellectual concept, nothing more. Even the furnishing of what had used to be her own old room as a nursery had given her no realization of the baby as a new and separate entity. A thrill of awed gladness came to her now, an anticipation so poignant that it erased the last traces of the uneasiness which Nicholas had caused her. "Why did you say you'd been worried, Peggy?" she asked dreamily. "This sensation is wonderful. Nothing to worry about." The maid hesitated, but it could do no harm to tell, now that everything must be fine. "'Tis late you are in feeling it, Mum, with you going into your 7th month. I've been watching you and waiting these 6 weeks." She did not add that she had fortified her own considerable knowledge of midwifery by anxious consultations with Mrs. McNabb, the housekeeper. Miranda, protected both by ignorance and this new bliss, laughed placidly. "Well, perhaps he's a very plump baby and was too lazy to move sooner." Peggy laughed too, but as she pulled the curtains and placed the screen before the dying fire, she thought, "The Holy Blessed Mother grant that she's right, and that it isn't that the poor mite was too feeble to make himself known." A stormy November full of sleet and hail became a cold, snowy December. It was, after all, unnecessary for Nicholas to make overt resistance to change on his manor, for as yet the new laws had not been passed, nor the new governor taken hold. It was, in fact, to be 8 years before the last of the litigation and state suits against landlords for the trying of titles finally simmered into peace. In the meantime, the tenants, having won their point and certain of eventual victory, settled down again more equably than they had for years. On December 6th, the manor house was again thrown open for the St. Nicholas Day feast to the children. This year, none of the neighboring river families' children were invited. Nicholas had no intention of risking refusals. Had it not been for Miranda's condition, he would before this have concentrated his will on the subduing of these families who dared hold aloof. He would have invited important guests from New York, enlisted the aid of old Martin Van Buren, and given a ball of such dazzling brilliance that the countryside would have come out of curiosity if nothing else. As it was, this must wait until spring, when Miranda had recovered, and there would be an heir to Dragonwyck. Chapter 17. It was on this same St. Nicholas Day that a troopship from New Orleans docked in New York. It landed 100 wounded men and caskets containing those who could no longer feel their wounds. Jeff Turner was amongst those in the first category, and still too much shattered to be thankful that he was not in the second. A Mexican bullet had ripped upward through his left arm and collarbone, laid open his cheek, and ploughed a groove through the side of his skull before it vanished into the bright tropical sky. Though all the wounds had promptly begun to fester, Jeff's sturdy frame could have withstood that, and the disablement of his arm and shoulder. He would have directed the cautery and splinting himself, and then have proceeded enthusiastically with his division under General Worth to Saltillo. But the head wound was another matter. He had been unconscious for days. He had been dumped on a gun carriage in Monterey and dragged back to General Taylor's base at Cerralvo. Here he had received hurried treatment in a hospital tent, and as he still declined either to regain consciousness or to die, he had been bundled into an empty supply wagon with a score of others, and eventually reached the Texan coast, where a sloop conveyed them to New Orleans. The good sisters at the Charité cared for him there, while the skull fracture healed enough to permit him to travel home. Jeff had intended going upriver to Hudson at once, but as he lurched off the gangplank onto the pier, he knew that he must have rest first. It was still a struggle to stand for long. He was subject to sharp attacks of dizziness. There were crowds of anxious relatives on the dock, but none for him. He grasped his dilapidated carpet-bag with his good hand and strode through the press, praying that he might not keel over and make a scene. A few sympathetic glances were directed at the scar on his cheek and the dangling left coat sleeve. Though the arm had healed, the collarbone was slower and still needed the support of a sling. When he reached the sidewalk, the city noises banged on his sensitive nerves like thunder. Horses, drays, and hurrying people merged crazily, swimming around him in slow spirals. "Damn," thought Jeff, gritting his teeth. He tumbled into a hack, muttered, "Hotel, cheap one, anywhere," and shut his eyes. The driver took him at his word, trotted his horse 2 blocks along South Street, and decanted Jeff at Schmidt's Tavern, where he found himself established in a bare, dismal room priced at 50 cents a day. It was clean, however, and it had a bed upon which Jeff flung himself after getting rid of Mrs. Schmidt, the landlady, who showed a sentimental German disposition to cluck and yearn over him. He lay for 2 hours in a semi-stupor, until the throbbing in his collarbone roused him. He sat up and ran his fingers impatiently over a lump on his shoulder. Another pocket of pus had formed on the surface of the partly healed wound. He scowled at it as he screwed his head around trying to see it. There was no mirror in the room. A quick cut of the scalpel it needed, and a wet dressing. His bag of instruments was left behind at Cerralvo among the cactus and yuccas. He made a sudden resolution, scribbled a note, and shouting for the landlady, told her to have it delivered. Then he tottered back to the bed. It was dusk when he heard heavy footsteps ascending the stairs and a knock on his door. Dr. John Francis walked in. "Well, so you're back again, my fine young hero," he said, chuckling, and extending his hand as casually as though they'd met yesterday. His wise eyes missed nothing of Jeff's condition, but he would no more have expressed his sympathy than Jeff would have welcomed it. "Been making love to a cannonball?" he inquired genially, plumping his black bag on the floor and sitting on the bed. "Could you not find something warmer and softer to embrace down there? No, don't sit up. Do as I tell you, young squirt. Lie still. You think you know it all, I'll be bound, but you're not as good a medico as I am yet. Yes, I see it. Do you take me for a mole?" While he kept up an affectionate grumbling, his gnarled fingers were busy palpitating the arm wound, the abscess on the collarbone, the healed scar on the cheek, the depression in the scalp. "You've not much improved your beauty," he observed with a twinkle, kicking his bag over to the bed and bending with a grunt to extract a scalpel. "How'd it happen?" "Just one bullet," confessed Jeff ruefully. He indicated its upward path with a quick motion of his thumb. "Was the greaser in a hole, then, or were you maybe skulking in a tree?" inquired the old doctor, and while he spoke, he jabbed the scalpel deep. "Ouch!" said Jeff. "No, I wasn't in a tree, but I was on a roof." "What are you dousing on that compress, sir? I never saw stuff like that. Plain water'll do, or maybe you should cauterize again." "Deliver me," retorted the old man with a terrible frown, "from treating another doctor, especially a young know-it-all. Mind your business, my boy, and let me mind mine. You called me in, didn't you? You want this dog-gasted mess of a shoulder to heal, don't you?" "Yes, sir," said Jeff, smiling, "but what's that brown stuff? It burns like a red-hot poker."
It's seaweed and alcohol, made for me by an old Chinee on Pell Street. And I don't know why it oft-times keeps a wound from festering, so don't ask me. The Chinamen know a lot about medicine, and I'm not too proud to try their drugs. No more should you be." He tied up the sling. "You'll do now, my lad. Couple of months from now you'll be as good as new, barring that scar on your cheek, though doubtless the ladies'll consider it highly romantic. If you rest a lot and act like a sensible human being, the dizzy spells will pass too." He dumped his scalpel, bandages, and the brown bottle pell-mell into his bag, which he snapped shut. He lit himself a black and foul-smelling cigar, settled his massive body on the one rickety chair, and turned a look of anticipation on Jeff. "Now, what in blazes were ye doing on a rooftop in Monterey?" At first, Jeff searched for words, struggling against the universal reluctance to talk of battle to those who know nothing of it. But gradually the old man's eager interest had its effect. Jeff forgot the 4 musty walls about him. They expanded into desert and dust, into brown adobe in the blinding gleam of white plaster under the Mexican sun. Old rough-and-ready Taylor had made shrewd plans for the capture of Monterey. He had sent General Worth with 1,800 men, of whom Jeff was one, on a circuitous route to the other side of the city, while Taylor created a diversion on the eastern side to cover their march. On September 20th, Worth had arrived at his position, and the city of Monterey lay between the pincers which inexorably narrowed down on it. One after another, the Mexican forts fell. Federacion, Independencia, and the Bishop's Palace on the west, Teneria and Libertad on the east. On the morning of the 23rd, the Americans advanced into the bewildered city from both sides. But instead of risking life in the streets, which were raked by artillery fire and covered by snipers from shuttered windows, the American soldiers were ordered into the houses, where they tunneled their way through the interior walls, progressing through a cloud of plaster and falling rubble toward the Grand Plaza. By sunset, both halves of the army had reached to within 1 block of the plaza. Here, the Mexican troops were huddled awaiting orders from their leader, Ampudia, whose efficiency did not match his courage. General Worth called for volunteers to plant a small mortar on an exposed rooftop, which would command the square. "And I suppose ye jumped up like a jack-in-the-box," growled Dr. Francis, "when ye should have been back of the base caring for the wounded."
Jeff reddened, then laughed sheepishly.
"Well, we hauled up that mortar and stuck it where it did a lot of good. The hot shells had mowed down a dozen of 'em at a clip, but they didn't let us enjoy ourselves long."
Jeff paused again.
"It's curious," he said thoughtfully, "but I saw my bullet coming. He was a handsome Mexican, had a fine face. I saw him squinting up along the barrel of his gun down there on the street. For a second we looked right at each other, and I had a crazy feeling of liking him. Then I ducked, but not fast enough." He grinned. "That's all I know firsthand of our capture of Monterey, for I didn't rightly come to from the blackness and the haze until they dumped me in the Charité at New Orleans." "I kind of like that greaser of yours, too," remarked Dr. Francis grimly. "You needed a bullet to knock some sense into you. Now you're here, you'll stay this time, my lad. Move into my office tomorrow. Start learning the ropes. I'll not work ye too hard till your brains have got unaddled."
Jeff sent the old doctor a look of affection. He perfectly understood the little plan to give him a rest at a salary. For a moment he was tempted. If he went in with Dr. Francis, it would mean a big society practice, the idea of which he loathed, but it would also mean money enough for research and association with a man whom he deeply admired. But that was just the trouble. Jeff's fiercely independent soul wouldn't stomach the thought of being beholden to anyone, or slipping easily into a ready-made practice. Besides, he was needed at home. He had been startled and touched at the dismay of his patients when he had enlisted. The old man read his face.
"Yes, there you go," he grumbled. "I see that mule look. Independent as the hog on ice. Go on back to your little J-town. Kill yourself for a parcel of flea-bitten yokels."
He blew his nose stertorously. Jeff's second refusal was a grievous disappointment. Every man of achievement longs for a disciple, a younger edition of himself with whom to share the accumulated wisdom and the experience of the past. That few men ever find this disciple, Dr. Francis knew well, and now, having found him, it was hard to be balked. Still, he understood Jeff's reasons and honored him for them. Both men were companionably silent for a while. The old doctor wreathed himself in clouds of tobacco smoke, and the young one gazed absently at the ceiling.
"Saw a friend of yours last summer. Seemed mighty interested in you," offered Francis suddenly.
Jeff turned and looked his question.
"Right pretty girl. Married, though, so you needn't get all het up. Mrs. Nicholas Van Ryn, wife to that high mucky-muck whatever you may call him up on the Hudson."
Jeff expelled his breath and sat up. "Where'd you meet Miranda?" he said sharply.
The other raised his bushy eyebrows. "So, it's Miranda, is it? I met her at the Poe's cottage, and she made me a cup of tea with her own lily-white hands."
"How was she looking?"
The old man snorted. "Far as I remember, she'd a pink satin dress and some darn fool feather in her bonnet. She'd a mighty trim ankle and a mighty trim waist, all right." "All right," he said in response to Jeff's ejaculation. "She looked healthy enough, if that's what you want to know."
The old man gave him a satiric look and grinned.
"Waist not so trim now, I'll be bound. She must be 2 months from term."
"What?" cried Jeff violently. Dr. Francis chuckled at Jeff's air of stupefaction.
"Anybody ever tell you about the stork, Jeff? Bird that's likely to come moseying along when a young couple's married? Or when they're not, for that matter."
Jeff made an impatient gesture. "How do you know she's pregnant?" He had managed to forget Miranda quite completely during his months in Mexico, had shut the memory of her away in an airtight compartment, and thought that any sentimental yearnings he had had for her were done with. He was therefore annoyed to discover how much he disliked the thought of her bearing a child to Nicholas.
"I know," answered Dr. Francis, "because the great Mr. Van Ryn wrote me about it. He favored me with a request, more like a royal command at that. Wanted me to move up to his manor and hang around for weeks until his lady takes a notion to produce this marvelous infant."
"Are you going?" asked Jeff slowly.
"I am not. I told him most politely that I'd better use for my time than to fuss over one healthy girl, counting every pulse beat. He can find himself some other tame puppy. Plenty'd be glad enough to get the fee he offered. Come to think of it, you can do it yourself now. You'd be right handy."
"No," said Jeff explosively. The old doctor leaned back and contemplated the young man.
"Little bit smitten with the lady's charms, aren't you?"
"It's not that. But, well, Van Ryn wouldn't want me. I attended the death of his first wife." Dr. Francis nodded.
"What'd she die of, anyway? Wasn't it kind of sudden?"
"Acute indigestion. Very sudden," Jeff answered curtly. The memory of his suspicions of Nicholas now shamed him. They must have sprung from unrecognized jealousy. His face grew hot when he thought of those bungling little experiments he had made on the tipsy cake.
"Why don't you get married, Jeff?"
The old man put down his cigar and laid an affectionate hand on Jeff's good shoulder.
"Must be some tidy little woman around who pleases you. And if you're not so fond of her at first, you'll get to be once she's yours."
He chuckled.
"Lots of truth in what old Benjamin Franklin said. All cats look gray at night."
Jeff smiled and thought of Faith Folger. On the day he had sailed downriver to join the army, she had stood at the Hudson dock beside her mother. The black eyes had been full of tears. "I'll be waiting for thee, Jeff," she had whispered, "until thee comes back." He had kissed her quickly while her mother pretended not to see. The kiss had meant little to him, for his mind had been full of Miranda, and in any case he had not really expected to come back. But now the thought of Faith was comforting.
"I think I'll take your advice, sir," he said to Dr. Francis, "as soon as I have 2 whole arms and a steady head to offer a woman."
Hudson welcomed Jeff home with wild enthusiasm. Had he permitted it, they would have made a hero of him, but as he refused to be lionized, they contented themselves with flocking to his little house on Front Street and bringing gifts: calf's foot jelly, pound cake, ducks and chickens already roasted. The old black Rilla had nothing to do but fuss over Jeff and serve the dainties which were provided. By New Year's Day, it seemed to Jeff that he had never been away at all. His left arm was stiff, but had regained its usefulness. The spells of vertigo diminished in frequency, and he could ignore them enough to take on a restricted practice. He had not yet proposed to Faith. He did send her a New Year's present, the Golden Chalice, or Mental Draughts from Many Fountains, a popular gift book that year, prettily bound in red leather tooled with gilt. Faith was encouraged. The Casket of Love, or The Wedding Guest, would have been more significant, to be sure, but any gift book was indicative of serious intentions, and she made her plans for a June wedding. Now that he was home again, she must on no account allow their relationship to slip back into the old half-teasing, flirtatious state. She wanted Jeff, and had turned down 3 flattering proposals for his sake. It was high time that he spoke the decisive words. But January passed, and Jeff remained unaccountably elusive. He refused invitations, pleading the need for rest. When Faith, growing desperate, invented a persistent headache and trudged through the snowy streets to consult him at his office, he received her warmly, even tenderly, but he didn't speak. He told her to avoid fried foods for a while and take a dose of calomel, then sent her away again, baffled, but not quite disconsolate. For she knew men, and there had been a special note in his voice, an admission of intimacy in his manner, and besides, she knew she had no rival. There was hardly a girl in Hudson who hadn't tried to interest Jeff, and he paid no attention to any of them. In fact, Jeff intended to propose eventually, but he had a male reluctance to being stampeded or to committing himself irretrievably. He finally decided that on St. Valentine's Day he would take the plunge, send her one of those sugary, sentimental effusions which delight the girlish heart, follow it up by a formal call at her parents' house. But when the 14th of February came, poor Faith received no valentine from Jeff. He was at Dragonwyck. Jeff had again made up his mind to forget Miranda and succeeded quite well. An epidemic of grippe inflicted itself on Hudson, and in consequence he was too busy and too tired to think at all. Then he got a letter from Dr. Francis in New York. Following the usual greetings and inquiries, it said, "Don't be surprised if you're called to the Van Ryns after all, for I've taken the liberty to write the Grand Seigneur, heartily recommending your skill. He's got Brown there for his wife, Dr. William Brown from Gramercy Park. I know the man and he's able enough, but the trouble seems to be Van Ryn has got him terrified. Brown is in a funk, thinks matters aren't progressing just right and daren't tell Van Ryn. He sneaked a letter out to me begging for advice, but I cannot make head or tail of it. Sounds like a normal pregnancy to me. I wrote back to the poor numbskull. My private opinion is that the size of his fee has addled his wits, telling him not to worry. Delivering babies is simple as rolling off a log. Dame Nature does it for you, though we can't let the layman guess that. But I ended up by telling him to get in touch with you if he needs help.
Then I got a letter from Van Ryn himself, complaining about Brown and begging me to go up there after all. So I handed him to you, too. All this pother. The grand sham of Tartary would not make half the rumpus about an Eyre, I'll be bound."
Jeff threw the letter on his desk. Even if they did send for him, he wouldn't go. Nothing would induce him to involve himself again with Miranda, or the dark intricacies of Dragonwyck. Dr. Francis was right, and it was all a ridiculous pother. She had one qualified physician on hand to attend her, and there was doubtless nothing wrong with her anyway. She'd always been a healthy farm girl, strong as a horse despite her air of fragility. Next morning at 8, his bell pealed, and he opened the door to see Nicholas, muffled in a fur coat, standing on his doorstep, and behind him a red sleigh and panting horse. The two men looked at each other silently a moment. Then Nicholas held out his hand. "Will you come back with me, Turner?" he said almost humbly. "We need you." Jeff frowned and receded from the door. "You have a doctor up there. I could do nothing more than he will," he answered coldly. "Dr. Francis wrote me." Nicholas shook his head. "Brown's a fool. I don't trust him. I beg of you to come, to hurry. There are certain symptoms. Brown says labor is starting." He spoke in jerks. His face was haggard. His eyes, devoid now of all condescension or irony, were simply pleading. Jeff had dealt with many an anxious father, but Nicholas' tension seemed excessive. "What reason have you to think that Mrs. Van Ryn is in danger?" asked Jeff gravely. Nicholas looked at him. "Miranda?" he said doubtfully. "I don't know that Miranda's in any danger. Do hurry, Turner, I beg of you." Jeff was startled. Was this frenzy of apprehension then only for the baby? Why did this man never seem to be motivated by a normal, understandable emotion? He felt a sudden sharp pity for the girl immured there at Dragonwyck. He sighed and reached for his greatcoat, cramming his stiff arm into the left sleeve with difficulty. "I don't know what I can do, but I'll come with you." As they whirled up under the porte cochere and Nicholas yanked the trembling horse to a stop, the door flew open and Peggy stumbled out. "Oh, master," she gulped, her mouth working. "Missus is took bad and they won't let me near her. Please let me go to her." Nicholas pushed her roughly aside, not troubling to answer, and together the two men hurried up the stairs. Two people hovered over the great bed on which Miranda lay moaning, Dr. Brown and the German wet nurse whom Nicholas had also imported from New York. The doctor was normally a dapper little man with an ingratiating bedside manner which had won him many influential patients. But now his pomaded locks were in disarray, his neat beard glistened with the sweat that had run down his face. "What's the matter?" cried Nicholas, turning on him furiously. The little doctor gave his patron a look of concealed terror. Nothing wrong, Mr. Van Ryn," he stammered. "Labor has started, but everything is quite all right. Oh, quite, quite." His air of false brightness deceived no one, not even the wet nurse, who muttered "Ach, Himmel" under her breath and stared round-eyed at Nicholas. "Mr. Van Ryn, would you and the nurse mind going out while I consult with Dr. Brown?" interposed Jeff, with a calmness designed to quell this atmosphere of hysteria. "I'm sure there's no need for alarm." As soon as the door closed, Dr. Brown mopped his face and heaved a sigh of relief. "Oh, thank God you're here, Turner. I can't take the responsibility alone." He no longer cared that he might have to share his magnificent fee. He would gladly have foregone the whole fee if he could have been allowed to return with honor to his safe and placid Gramercy Square practice. "The man's a maniac," he added somberly. "I think he'd kill me if anything went wrong." "Nonsense," said Jeff, moving to the bed. "My dear chap, you don't know," whispered Dr. Brown, glancing nervously at the door where Nicholas had gone out. "I tried to resign from the case, and he locked me in my room. He watches me all the time, glaring with those icy blue eyes. Sometimes I think he's mesmerizing me." "Rubbish," said Jeff, concealing a smile. He held up his hand for silence because Miranda gave a long, shuddering moan and opened her eyes. "Jeff?" she whispered on a little questioning note like a surprised child. "You're in Mexico, aren't you?" "No," he answered, smiling. He smoothed the matted waves of golden hair from her wet temples. "I'm here with you." From miles and miles away, the pain sent again its first tingle of warning. In that shadow world there was no room for anything but acceptance and the pain. She groped blindly for Jeff's hand, deriving from its strong, comforting grip the first reassurance she had had. The demon flung itself on her quivering body, wrestling, grinding, tossing, until once more slaked, it threw her aside. Dr. Brown said, astonished, "I didn't know you knew, Mrs. Van Ryn." "Yes," answered Jeff briefly. He profited by the interval of peace to make a quick examination. Everything was entirely normal and going well. He saw no reason at all for concern and told his colleague so. The little doctor brightened. "Glad to hear you think so. Must be the atmosphere of this gloomy place gave me the jim-jams. I don't know, though. I think there's been something queer about the fetal heartbeat. Awfully hard to catch through the stethoscope." "It often is," retorted Jeff. He now thoroughly agreed with Dr. Francis and Nicholas that the man was a fool, and that his nervousness had obscured his judgment. At 4:00 of the following morning, Valentine's Day, Miranda was delivered of a son. The baby was well-formed and handsome, as he could hardly help but be, having sprung from exceptionally good-looking parents. He had a good deal of dark hair and straight brows like his father, and at the corner of his mouth appeared a tiny mole like Miranda's. His arrival was greeted with wild rejoicing. The Dragonwyck church bells clanged welcome, a signal to the tenants that there would be rum punch and beer served all day from the kitchens. The servants poured themselves mug after mug, unchecked by any discipline. Peggy crept away to her room to offer a prayer of thanksgiving to the Blessed Virgin. She had been reinstated in the sick room for the last hours of labor as soon as Jeff had understood from Miranda that she wanted her little maid. As for Nicholas, he refused to leave the cradle in the nursery, where the baby lay nestled in silk and lace, but stood motionless, gazing down at its little face. It was Jeff who stayed with Miranda. She was floating in the drowsy peace that follows childbirth. In this state of confused joy, no one seemed very real, but she was faintly conscious of hurt that Nicholas had not come to her after her ordeal, more sharply conscious of gratitude to Jeff. He had been the rock to which she clung through it all, his quiet, soothing voice the only comfort. To the passionate gratitude which most women feel toward the physicians who deliver them, Miranda added something more. Though she was not to suspect it for a long time, it was during those hours after her baby's birth that Miranda first felt love for Jeff. She knew now only that she was at peace and happy. But for him there was neither happiness nor peace. He had known from that moment in which she blindly reached for his hand that there would never again be question of marrying Faith or anyone else. This disquieting revelation he pushed aside to be dealt with later. There was a more important fact to be faced right now, and he sat rigid by Miranda's bed trying to determine what to do. Dr. Brown's nervous forebodings had, after all, had a basis, though the man was too stupid to realize it and was getting pleasurably drunk in his room on Nicholas's best brandy. Jeff had instantly noted the bluish tinge in the baby's skin, the clubbing of the tips of the tiny fingers. As soon as he had dared leave Miranda, he had placed the wooden tube of his stethoscope on the little chest and found his worst fears confirmed. The heartbeat was spasmodic and so feeble that it seemed each sighing breath the infant drew must be its last. "I may be wrong," thought Jeff grimly. "I've been wrong before." But he knew he was not. The baby's heart was defective. It might live an hour, it might live a month, but longer than that was an impossibility. He walked down the hall to the nursery and found Nicholas still standing beside the cradle, while the wet nurse sat and rocked in the corner of the room and suckled her own baby. Jeff took a deep breath. "Mr. Van Ryn," he said gently, "I've got to tell you, the baby's not well. He has a bad heart condition." He waited, but by not so much as a quiver of a muscle did Nicholas indicate that he had heard. What's the matter with the man, thought Jeff, angry because this strained immobility made him nervous in spite of himself. He had a quick presentiment and peered into the cradle, but the baby still breathed. So Jeff tried again. "It sometimes happens like this. I can't tell you how sorry I am. At least your wife has come through beautifully, and—" He paused, went on with stony disregard of his own revulsion. "Some day there can be other babies." Nicholas raised his head in a quick darting motion, and the young doctor instinctively stepped back. There was menace in that poised body, and Jeff felt a sharp, atavistic fear. "My son is entirely well," said Nicholas softly. "I appreciate your services, and they shall be suitably recompensed. You may go now." A hot anger rose in Jeff. The sight of his head wound began to throb. "You won't believe me, will you?" he cried roughly. "You never believe anything you don't want to believe, do you?" He clamped his mouth shut, struggling for control. The baby gave a weak, gasping cry, pitifully unlike the usual cry of the newborn. Jeff bent quickly over the cradle, sensing as he did so the defensive gesture from the other man, as though Nicholas would ward him off. "Listen, Van Ryn," said Jeff, all anger gone, for suddenly he saw pathos in this stubborn guardianship of a hopeless cause. "You've got to face it. This baby won't live. It's a miracle he wasn't stillborn." And far better if he had been, he added mentally. "The heart is malformed, probably a constricted aorta. No amount of care or nursing will help. It's nobody's fault. Nothing could have prevented it. It's just a tragic accident." He had chosen his words carefully, striving to break through that impenetrable wall which was reared against him. He saw with despair that he had made not the slightest impression. "You have great confidence in your opinion, Dr. Turner," said Nicholas politely enough, "but in this case I have none." He left the cradle and walked to the window. "The sleigh is waiting below to take you back." Silence fell on the room, broken only by the lusty gurgles of the other healthy baby at the wet nurse's breast and the creak of her rocking chair. "At least," Jeff cried, "let me prepare Miranda. Whatever you may wish to believe, it's damnable cruelty not to warn her." Nicholas turned from the window. "There's no reason whatever for you to see Mrs. Van Ryn again. Good day, sir." He ushered Jeff to the head of the stairs and stood there, so that there was no possibility of communicating either with Miranda or Dr. Brown. Propelled by the force of Nicholas's will, Jeff descended the stairs. "I can't leave her like this," he thought, "alone to face tragedy, alone with that madman." Even as he thought madman, his scientific training rejected the term as inaccurate. Nicholas was not conventionally insane. He was in fuller control of his faculties than most men ever could hope to be. Not mad, but something far more dangerous. A powerful soul obeying nothing but its own desires and moving in a realm outside the normal. But this was no time for analysis. Jeff could do nothing about Nicholas. He stood irresolutely in the lower hall until the sight of a servant scuttling past gave him an idea.
"Will you send Peggy to me at once?" said Jeff in a low voice, "Mrs. Van Ryn's maid." He heard the door to the servants' wing open, and a light shuffling step. Peggy limped quickly up to him. "Yes, sir? Did you be wanting of me?" Jeff nodded gravely. "Yes, there's no one but you can help." He told her, and the brown eyes filled with tears. "Ah, the poor sweet mistress, 'tis cruel hard. I was thinking the wee one didn't be acting right from the start." "You'll take care of her, Peggy, and help her to bear it." The girl swallowed. "I love her," she said simply, and seeing Jeff's change of expression, the corners of her mouth lifted. "And I'm thinking you do too, Doctor dear," she added softly. "Now don't be furrowing your brow at me. I couldn't help but be using me eyes in those grim hours of the past night, and 'tis little enough of love there is in this strange great house." Yes, thought Jeff, chilled, that's true perhaps. But Miranda had chosen this strange great house, had fervently desired the man who owned it. So far as Jeff knew, she had never regretted her choice. He picked up his bag and smiled at Peggy. "I'm glad she has you anyway. If you're ever in Hudson, come and let me have a look at that leg. There might possibly be something to be done." "'Tis kind he is, kind and good," thought Peggy passionately, as she hurried through the baize door before anyone spied her in the front hall. "Not like him upstairs, with his eyes as cold as the winter sky."